The origin of species and speciation. The origin of species and speciation is a topic that is challenging to discuss and even more difficult to properly define. Some questions that come to mind are, if evolution is a continuous process, then how does it produce such profound variation among species? How and when are these jumps made? These changes obviously don't happen overnight, but at times it seems as though they do. Also, why do some species simply evolve over time while other species become two distinct new ones? But before we can explain speciation or the development of a new species, we must define what a species is. There are several different ways to define a species, and one of the simplest answers to that is appearance. Generally, members of the same species will resemble each other more so than other species. This is called the morphological species concept. A prime example that adheres to this definition are tigers, which Coyne uses to describe as, quote, all Asian cats whose adults are more than 5 feet long and have vertical black stripes on an orange body with white patches around the face and mouth. In the picture, it's pretty obvious that the tiger to the left is of a different species to the jaguar on the right, with the tiger possessing a larger, heavier body and different coloration. This method was used by Linnaeus in 1735 to classify species, and it still does have its uses. However, the morphological species concept does have its limitations. If it defines that all members of the same species look alike, then how does it explain sexual dimorphism? An example to this would be the male and female black widow spider, which both look nothing alike as the males are smaller and often of a different color. Upon seeing them, you would swear they were of a different species. Even humans cannot be defined using the morphological species concept, as humans from different parts of the world can look very different. These differences can include, but are not limited to, height, skin color, facial features, and even language. The reason why humans are defined as the same species is because we are not reproductively isolated, as all humans are capable of producing fertile offspring, and our genes are constantly flowing. In nature, there are also what are called cryptic species, which are species that look almost identical under scrutiny, such as mosquitoes. Oftentimes, more involved methods are required for proper identification. But what separates them as different species is the reproductive isolation. Their genes don't intermingle and they cannot hybridize. More defining is required to properly define a species, since the morphological species concept cannot do it alone, which leads to the biological species concept.
The biological species concept. This concept was first thought of by Ernest Mayr and Russian geneticist Theodosis Dobzhansky. Ernest Mayr defined a species as a group of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. But what exactly does this mean? So, the biological species concept is really important because it is a clear way of classifying organisms. Though it has its flaws, many use this concept to classify organisms into a species. The biological species concept is based on differences, whether it be on traits, differences in appearance, differences in behavior or physiology. If a member of a species doesn't recognize you, then they won't want to mate with you, at least for most of the time. Over time, this leads to reproductive isolation. Basically, if there's no gene flow or mixing up of the genes, then you're going to diverge into two different species over time. Now, I wanted to include a picture to show what I'm talking about. And in this picture right here, you have color differences in these dinosaur-like creatures. And basically over time, they like to mate with their own color. And so that led to reproductive isolation and eventually speciation, where these two no longer would ever be able to mate with each other, so they're two different species. I wanted to include a comprehensive example, and luckily for me, Coyne mentions a great example about fruit flies. In this real example, all barriers that I previously mentioned, like differences in trait, behavior, physiology, all come together. On the tropical island of Sao Tome live two different kinds of fruit flies on a volcano. One lives on the top half of the volcano, the other lives on the bottom half. These two species do meet in the middle, right about here. Now, these two species don't usually mate. That is because there's differences in their behavior. There is differences in their courtship display. So they don't usually mate. But if they were to mate, and it happens rarely, what ends up happening is that the sperm of one species is poor at fertilizing the eggs of the other. So if any offspring are produced, it would be very little. Of those few offspring, the males would be sterile. These two different fruit flies are separate species under the biological species concept. The next topic I want to talk about is the theory of geographic speciation. What this theory is saying is that before you can have genetic isolation, you must first be geographically isolated. I included this little picture to help visualize what's happening. On the top, you have Christmas trees that all look the same because to me, and according to this picture, they all belong to the same kind of Christmas tree. Now, it's not a fact that they're Christmas trees, that's just what they look like to me. Now, the concept is that over time, the environment's going to change. The geography is going to change, more importantly. And in this example, you have what is a river. And so this river formed, and what happened was that it took some of the Christmas trees. And over time, they pretty much became a new species because there was no gene flow. So they became a new species, and that's what the theory of geographic speciation is saying, is that you must have a geographic event separate one species so that they can become two species, and this will happen over a large amount of time. It's a very slow process, but at the end of it, you get two different types of Christmas trees. So it's a win-win. So what is the evidence for geographic speciation? It's important to note the evidence for this process can be quite difficult to find. One reason being is that this is a process that takes thousands of years, if not millions, so we can't see it with our own eyes. But we can find areas geographically that suggest a process like this has happened. So once there is geographic isolation, you would expect to find sexual barriers to form between the isolated and the parent population. This has been tested in the labs, and sexual barriers do arise just generations after they have been isolated. So there is proof for geographic speciation, and it does stand.
It is fairly easy to find evidence for allopatric speciation. However, there are incidences of species that arose in the same area without the presence of major geographic barriers. How is this even possible? According to Coyne, despite the chances being small, it is mathematically possible. Real-world examples given by Coyne are the presence of multiple fish species found on the isolated islands of Lake Cameron. However, the fact that speciation has not occurred in some locations is also good evidence for evolution. For instance, we have instances of isolated islands that are not inhabited by sister species. Logically, why would a creator just randomly put species that aren't closest relatives to each other in the same area? Especially when most of the time on the mainland, we see closely related species localized to the same regions. The process of developing reproductive barriers in a constantly mixing population typically takes a really long time. However, there are certain mechanisms that allow for instances of really rapid sympatric speciation, especially in plants. Allopolyploidal speciation starts with the hybridization of two different species in the same area. After hybridization occurs, the number of chromosomes in the new hybrid's gamete doubles. This makes the hybrid fertile, yet unable to reproduce with either of its parents. Consequently, it can now be regarded as a new species. Autopolyploidy happens without hybridization. A single species has a gamete with double the number of chromosomes typically found in a gamete. This means it can produce fertile offspring if it mates with another gamete that also has the same condition. However, sterile hybrids will be created if it attempts to breed with a gamete from the parent species, because the resulting hybrid will have unpaired chromosomes. For either mechanism to occur, the union of a sperm and an egg gamete with a normally high number of chromosomes is necessary. Wouldn't this occurrence be rare? When you consider the plant mechanisms of reproduction and the fact that plants produce millions of gametes, it can be realized that an occurrence of polyploid speciation is not that implausible. Interestingly, it is so common that it is thought that all species of flowering plants were formed via some polyploid mechanism. And at least 70% of all plants have an ancestor that evolved via a polyploid mechanism. Hybrids in general, regardless of sterility, are pretty common. Bananas, for instance, are a hybrid. The cool thing about polyploid speciation is that it allows us to view speciation in real time. For example, Coyne mentions the flowering plant Senecio cambrensis in the daisy family. It was discovered in the UK in 1958, and it looks like a cross between groundsel and ragwort. However, ragwort wasn't in the UK until 1910. The plant also has the expected number of chromosomes expected in a hybrid species that evolved via an allopolyploid mechanism. On top of that, the species was able to be synthesized by a botanist by hybridizing both parent species. This should be enough evidence to support that mechanisms of speciation are both plausible and active even to this day. And that's it.
Yeah, that's